Hello and welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, Lee Donna. And no, I have not been adult napped. If you are watching the video version, you might think my background says otherwise, but I am recording from my new unfinished house. So you might hear some construction noise in the background and my dog barking or just prancing around with her teddy bear, figuring out all of the new little places where she can hide her things. She is a bit more OCD than I am, which is fun. And speaking of fun today, I have a tale for you that is ripped straight from the pages of American history, one that exploits the weaknesses of the human mind, both in the folly of youth and in the social standards thrust on the masses, making people feel the need to conform, even when there is absolutely no basis for the nonsense they are so dutifully conforming to. This particular thought study, as we will call it for our purposes today, is a multi night riot that took place in the greater New York City area during the fall of 1922, a year that saw the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, the exact same year that Mussolini and his black shirts marched on Rome. An event that led to Mussolini being appointed as the Prime Minister of Italy. In the United States, 1922 was the year that Warren G. Harding ushered in a new communication era by becoming the first U.S. president to be heard over the radio. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the 19th Amendment, ensuring that women had the right to vote. 1922 also witnessed the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and sadly, during a massive snowstorm, the roof of DC's Knickerbocker Theater collapsed, killing 98 people. In 1922, the average U.S. income for a full-time employee was around $33 a week, or roughly $1,700 per year. This translates to an annual income of around 27,000 in today's market, which is still well below the poverty level. In 1922, that $1,700 a year was below the $2,000 a year that was considered the minimum livable annual income for a family of five. Furthermore, it was estimated that 60% of American families were below this $2,000 poverty line. Most of us are probably aware that one place you will always see income inequality is in a city because there are more people, but also because of the socioeconomic studies that show there is less income inequality in towns, villages, or tribes where people are more closely related. It's kind of like in a small town, people will intervene and help others. But in a big city, there are numerous cases where people just watch as someone is beaten, raped, or even murdered. And not all of these are old cases. We are talking very recent, and it is really sad. But this is what happens when people lose their connection to one another. Empathy goes out the window and selfishness jumps in to take its place. During the early days of the Roaring Twenties, New York's stock market was in an economic boom, with many people investing borrowed money, which led to inflated stock prices and a false wealth, which is why so many were devastated during the Great Depression that would begin to hit at the end of the 1920s after the speculative stock bubble burst wide open. And I dare say it was this group of wealthy people who propagated the rigid fashion norm that a man could not wear a straw hat after September 15th each year because September 15th was dubbed Felt Hat Day. Yes, this was the day that every man put away his summer hat of straw and donned his warmer, more seasonally appropriate felt hat. Doing so virtuously signaled to society that the man was respectable, that he would conform to man made up rules, because not doing so would be an egregious breach of etiquette. To make matters worse, more than simply wearing the appropriate hat for the season, it was often customary to destroy your straw hat. No putting it up to wear it again next season. People would often just rip up the straw hats and toss them out. In 1922, the average cost of a straw hat ranged from $1 to $3. This is up to $39 in today's currency. So when you factor in a weekly wage for a man in 1922 that is already below the poverty level, it seems astounding that he would choose to trash his straw hat every year. A fact that becomes even more ridiculous when you consider that while straw hats were considered summertime wear, it was initially considered bad form for a man to wear this casual headpiece in the city, even during the height of summer. Originally, in the silly parts of the United States where people congregate and for some reason lose touch with reality, men were only allowed to wear straw hats if attending a sporting event or while boating. But by 1922, it was deemed perfectly acceptable by big city folk to wear their straw hats to work, so long as they did not wear them after September 15th, a date that was picked after people decided the original date of September 1st was too early to switch out their hats for the season. Now, obviously, this was not a law. It was just something that a socialite pulled out of thin air, promoted, and then changed the dates on. This happened often. There are many stories of the New York elite making up fashion rules until everyone started wearing what they said to wear, how they said to wear it. Only then the socialite would invite people to a party and tell only like a small group or certain ones about a new fashion trend so that the clique would show up all wearing this one new style, and then they could single out the others, making fun of them and just being mean to people over how they were dressed, which was how they were previously told to dress. So it's a whole thing. And those kinds of things are some of the best examples of how you should just do what you want to do, because trying to fit in means you are only trying to conform to a moving target. I am wholeheartedly against giving people that kind of power over me, and you should be too, because we can each rise and fall by our own merit. We don't need anybody else to do it for us. Back in 1922, not everyone understood that, so they propagated the seasonal wearing of certain types of hats, correlating your choice of headwear to your respectability as a person. Therefore, men and women alike wore hats, and if you did not own a hat or you were caught out without one, you were automatically labeled and cast in a negative light. So, generally, because most humans are afflicted with this ridiculous need to fit in, everyone tried their best to wear a hat. Even the impoverished 60% who usually worked long hours under harsh conditions and for too low of wages. With these hat rules reigning supreme, in 1922, it was socially acceptable for any friend of yours to yank an out of season hat off of your head and destroy it. Strangers were not supposed to destroy your hat, but they could mock you because, I mean, if you have the audacity to attempt to protect your head from the blazing sun with an out of fashion hat, well, then you deserve every bit of ridicule humanity has to offer. Furthermore, if you were not technically an adult, you were allowed to knock the hat off the heads of perfect strangers and stomp them right there in the street. This was such an acceptable tradition to let kids and teenagers take and destroy the personal property of others, that newspapers would simply put out articles warning people that the day to switch your hat was approaching. On September 15th, men needed to start wearing a felt hat or else. To be fair, though, they said the kids could only destroy straw hats after September 15th. And because young people love rules so much, in the years leading up to 1922, New York City was consistently sending out policemen to stop groups of teenagers who decided to start their hat smashing festivities early. So then it really should come as no surprise that this September hat issue was escalating. No one cared that it was a nonsense rule of made up social standards, nor did they care if a man was too poor to buy a new hat every year, let alone every season. On September 13th, 1922, 2 full days before the unspoken felt hat date, a group of teenagers took it upon themselves to invade an area of Manhattan where factory workers were minding their own business. Factory workers were poor, so when these kids showed up with sticks and started knocking off their hats and stomping on them, the factory workers fought back. Their fight turned into a brawl that stopped traffic, causing a backup on the Manhattan Bridge. This was the kickoff to similar events that would take place over the next 7 days. After police broke up the Manhattan brawl, the chaos continued to spread. Newspapers reported that gangs of teenagers and young adults were prowling the streets, armed with sticks, some of which had angled nails in the end that were supposed to allow the boys to more easily snatch hats off heads. But if these boys encountered a man who fought back, they used their nail-studded sticks to beat the man. Others were punching and kicking, knocking men down and stomping on them, beating the men so severely that they had to be transported to the hospital. Men like 25-year-old Harry Gerber, who was attacked by straw hat vandals in the area of 115th Street and Park Avenue. Harry tried to save his hat but was shoved to the ground, beaten and kicked until the boys ran off and Harry was transported to Harlem Hospital. Incidents like these led to reports flooding into local police stations, some detailing groups of up to 1,000 hat snatchers running wild and overtaking every pedestrian or open-aired car. These groups would position themselves along tracks where helpless victims of public transportation would be hit with sticks, as boys either attempted to snatch hats from the outside of the cars or would jump on board and run through the aisles. In other instances, these young people would force men to run through a gauntlet of boys armed with sticks. They would hide in doorways and jump out on unsuspecting passersby, 10 or 12 boys falling upon and attacking just one man. It was utter chaos, citizens in uproar with what one newspaper called groups of hoodlums running amok. A New York Times article dated September 16th, 1922, was subtitled, Gangs of Young Hoodlums with Spike Sticks Terrorize Whole Blocks. Police responded as they could, but they were quickly overwhelmed by what they deemed riots that were encompassing the greater New York City area. As soon as they broke up the gangs in one district, the teens and young adults would reform and continue their nefarious activities in other parts of the city. Even some off-duty police officers who were called in to help found their very own straw hats being ripped from their heads. One such officer was Detective Sergeant Brindizzo, who was attacked by a group of kids, his hat ripped off his head and thrown into the street. He chased after his hat thieves and said he would have caught them if not for 34-year-old Leo Cohen, a nearby onlooker, who tripped Detective Brindizzo, causing the lawman to fall face first into a gutter. Detective Brindizzo arrested Cohen, but when Cohen stood before the night court magistrate, Cohen claimed that not only was he innocent of interfering with the detective, but that he was an officer himself. a special one employed by a local restaurant. The magistrate let Cohen go, but others were not so lucky. Magistrate Peter A. Hadding was presiding over the night court, and he issued a statement that, quote, "It is against the law to smash a man's hat, and he has a right to wear it in a January snowstorm if he wishes. To hit a man's hat is a simple assault, and in this court it will be treated as such. And I want you to spread this word among all who would smash hats. A man's hat is just as much his property and just as much to be defended as his watch." End quote. This warning, as eloquent as it was, did not stop the hoodlums who persisted in stealing and destroying hats. And men were not the only ones being rushed to the hospital during these 8 nights of fashion-induced terror. One 10-year-old boy, James Sweeney, was so caught up in running through the streets with the older teens that he raced straight out into the road where he collided with a car and broke his right leg, earning himself a trip to Bellevue Hospital. Weirdly, in this incident, the New York Times said little James and his older friends were simply taking part in the hat smashing sport. And with attitudes like that, the city continued to descend into disorder, with the police struggling to contain the situation. Two plainclothes policemen were walking down 3rd Avenue when a dozen hat thieves armed with sticks jumped out of doorways to steal the hats of policemen King and Lamore. The officers pursued the boys, catching 8 of the 12. They took the boys to the nearest police station, but since each of the 8 boys was under the age of 15, they were not arrested. They were given a lecture, and then their parents were called to collect their offspring, with the station's Lieutenant Linehan recommending that the parents give their children a good spanking and warning that if the boys were brought back in again for the same offense, they would then be arrested. A 16-year-old boy named Morris did not get off so easy. When his group surrounded Harry Oldbaum, ripping the man's hat off his head, Harry fought back. When the crowd of boys took off running, so did Harry. He caught 16-year-old Morris and took him to the police station. Morris, being above the ripe old age of 15, was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. He was taken before Magistrate Hadding, and just before the magistrate was about to send the boy to jail, he spotted Morris's 70-year-old mother, her gray hair causing the magistrate to spare the boy for the sake of his mother. The magistrate warned that he was not going to give this sort of leniency to everyone, saying, quote, "I'll send the next one to jail. I intend to see that citizens are protected in their property." End quote. 17-year-old Louise Silverman was next in line, and Magistrate Hadding made good on his promise of jail time. He sentenced Silverman to 3 days in jail, and this is how the process continued for those 8 days, spanning from September 13th through the 21st. Officers were warned to be on the lookout for groups of hoodlums roaming the streets starting at around 8 p.m. every night. Between the officers and several accosted men being able to catch at least one boy from the groups that assaulted them, many young people were marched straight to the nearest police station. If the boys were over the age of 15, they were arrested. And lest we think this was only teenagers committing these crimes, there were some full-fledged adults in their 20s and 30s brought before the magistrate for disorderly conduct as well. The kids under the age of 15 were met with a couple of different fates. In some cases, they would be lectured and then released to their parents, as were the 8 boys I told you about earlier. In some of these instances, the parents of the boys walloped their kids right there in front of the police. However, there were other instances where the police gave the parents a choice to either go ahead and mete out their own justice via spanking right there in front of the lawman, or the boy would be taken in front of the magistrate right then, no second chance given. Furthermore, many of the officers noted that the most active hotspots where the remnants of straw hats were littering the roadways and sidewalks and where they caught loads of hoodlums curiously happened to be along blocks where there was a hat store. These hat stores, out of concern for their fellow man, stayed open long hours so that the devastated men who did not end up in the hospital could rush into the hat store and buy the season's latest felt hat, thus restoring themselves to respectability. It was further reported that these hat stores had lines of men keeping them busy throughout the night. So it is not much of a leap to think that greed enticed hat store owners to grease the palms of a few easily persuadable youths, ringleaders who would recruit their friends. One headline in the New York Tribune read, "Stores do thriving business, but many youthful marauders are arrested." To further the idea that hat stores might have been paying kids to behave badly, those of age who were arrested and taken before the magistrate were ultimately given the option of paying a $5 fine or spending time in jail. These youthful people who were statistically too poor to pay such a lofty fine mostly opted to pay the fine. These same hat smashing traditions continued after 1922, despite there being people beaten and hospitalized every year that this occurred. In 1924, a man was killed, and all because he was wearing a straw hat after the aristocracy decided to make up a day that the masses must switch their headwear. And yes, we know this came from the rich elite because if a pauper had made this up, no one would have cared. We only give this kind of ridiculous power to people with money and or the religious. It's what I like to call the brioche effect. If you don't know the history of brioche, you should look that up because it went from being poor people food to a special treat for the rich when the church decided to make it a sin against God for people to eat dairy on certain days unless you could afford to pay the church who would then, wash away the sin and make it okay for you to eat this thing. Such logical ideas coming from the virtuous amongst us. It's really crazy. And as I was thinking about how to wrap this episode up with a positive message, it occurred to me that the compass that will direct us to what is actually right is empathy. We have to value other humans and not at the neglect of ourselves or any form of martyrdom, but just general value to look at another person and know that they matter just as much as any of the rest of us do. I've had a really, really hard year, and some personal things have been building and festering for several years now. And in this process, I have felt very much as if I am losing empathy. And that has honestly been the most disturbing and difficult part of this process for me. So I really needed to do this episode to remind myself of how to course correct and of how dangerous even the most ridiculous, mundane, all in good fun thing can go awry when we forget the basics of being a decent human, a human free to wear whatever hat we want whenever we darn well please. Hit me up with your thoughts and opinions right after you hit that subscribe button. My email is leadonabooks@gmail.com. My website where you can purchase any of my thriller books and usually at a discount is leadonabooks.com. And you can join me on Patreon for bonus episodes and access to all of my books at patreon.com/LeeDonna. Yes, I am behind on some of the Patreon content and I owe you guys big time, but I thank you. I appreciate you. Even if you are not a Patreon subscriber, I appreciate you being here and listening to this episode today. I hope you have a wonderful day, a great week, and until next time, stay unfashionably fashionable.
immortal monsters.